Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this, what is it, the fourth seminar, I think, of the year, fourth or third, I have to track fourth, yes, I think so. And so today, I'm really excited to introduce Michael Feffer, who is a fourth-year student in our PhD program in societal computing. He's being co-advised by two great faculty, Zach Lipton and Hoda Hedari. And he's going to tell us about his research in the area of red teaming. Red teaming is a bit of perhaps a red herring too. He's going to tell us everything about, what that really means. You hear red teaming here and there. Everybody says, no worries, we're red teaming. We're checking all these foundation models. It's all good. We're putting a ton of effort. Trust us, blah, blah, blah. And so Michael will tell us really what's under the hood and how much of that is effective and how much of that might be a bit more of a pretense, I suppose. And then he's going to tell us about how we might want to organize our thinking in this space. And that's a good platform that we get started. So with that being said, Michael, the floor is yours, and thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks everyone for coming, and thank you for inviting me and having me. I'm Michael Feffer, PhD student here. In societal computing, and so I'm going to be presenting this work on red teaming that is a result of collaboration with my advisors, Zachary Lipton and Hoda Hedari, but then also two other collaborators within CMU, Anisha Sinha and Wesley Day. So overall outline of this talk is going to be as follows. First, I'm going to discuss the motivation for an approach of our research project. Then I'll describe the various methods we applied, including a case study analysis, research survey, and review of comments submitted to a NIST request for information. And then I'll detail the overall takeaways from all of these different methods that we employed. And then lastly, I'll conclude with recommendations for future red teaming informed by our research and takeaways. Also, I tend to speak pretty fast. I'll try to slow down, but if there's anything that's unclear, let me know. I'll try to slow down and repeat. And then also, most of the content in this is going to be content that can also be found in our paper. Definitely read that for more details about any of our specific analyses that we did. Some of this is also going to cover some more recent current events, which is kind of alluded to in our paper, but I'll be giving some more examples of things that have happened recently as additional context and motivation for our work. So just a heads up that if you read the paper, it might diverge a little bit from these slides. But yeah, just wanted to make that clear. So yeah, I'll start with the motivation and approach for now, and that if you're interested in privacy and ethical concerns of AI, you've probably seen slides like this, but I'll repeat kind of these more recent findings with GenAI technologies for completeness. So a lot of people have been very excited about GenAI, seeing it as a boon to productivity, maybe even creativity in some cases. Economic growth might be stimulated and so on. But at the same time, these models are also unleashing new categories of societal harms. And so these include, but are not limited to, replicating and amplifying various societal biases, as you can see in these stable diffusion outputs, showing what might be stereotypically represented as a lawyer versus a nurse. This is the privacy seminar, and obviously there are privacy concerns with some of the data that has been used to train these models, so that's actually led to a brief ban of ChatGPT in Italy because of it was going up against things like the EU AI Act and GDPR and so on. Also, in terms of accuracy, a law firm was fined, thousands of dollars because they used ChatGPT to write a brief, and then it hallucinated and gave fake references. And then, kind of beyond these, like stereotyping and privacy concerns, there are also just these more ethical concerns. Like, regardless of how you feel about Taylor Swift, she shouldn't have to deal with, explicit deepfakes on Twitter, arguably, and even people dying by suicide after talking with these AI chatbots. So again, there's a lot of excitement about these models. There are lots of people that use ChatGPT and similar every day, but there are also valid reasons for concern as well. So in answer to many of these concerns, these practitioners and policymakers alike have pointed to AI red teaming as an integral part of their strategies to identify and address these related risks, with the goal of ensuring some notion of alignment with human and societal values. So this U.S. presidential executive order on the safe, secure, and trustworthy development and use of AI refers to it 8 different times. This was passed in, I think, October of 2023. Yeah, October 2023. and defined red teaming as follows. So this it means a structured testing effort to find flaws and vulnerabilities in an AI system, often in a controlled environment and in collaboration with developers' AI, adopting adversarial methods to identify flaws and vulnerabilities, such as harmful or discriminatory outputs from an AI system, unforeseen or undesirable system behaviors, limitations, or potential risks associated with the misuse of the system. So let's scrutinize this definition a little bit, right? So on one hand, this seems to be a good idea, right? It's allegedly a process in which evaluators probe a system, find its flaws, and then fix its issues. So as such, one might find its inclusion in a policy document like a presidential executive order to be something welcome, and that we would be, it's an effort kind of mandated or encouraged by the federal government to safeguard these AI systems. So this is on one hand a good thing. On the other hand, this is actually really vague. So if we re-examine with this definition, it's typically or often in a controlled environment, typically involves adversarial methods. There's a lot of qualifying language that actually detracts from a concrete definition of what red teaming actually is.
It might be worth mentioning that this executive order was rescinded last week.
That was going to be my next slide. So yeah, so unfortunately, on top of that, yes, this executive order has recently gone away as of like a couple weeks ago, thanks to the new administration. But even before all this happened, a lot of industry and academic and even civil society players have called for red teaming as a practice. So it'll be interesting to see this space as this new administration is getting, more involved in these tech spaces, given partnerships with OpenAI on Stargate, for instance. So it'll be interesting to see if ideas about red teaming are still going to be around. I think they will be, especially because, again, a lot of these companies have really, introduced their, red teaming and like safeguarding proposals that include red teaming. But yeah, definitely worth keeping in mind that the federal government is kind of letting the companies do what they want. So yeah, watch this space, basically.
Obviously,
yes.
Not all their customers are in the US. There are also some of them in Europe. And
right.
So
yeah.
They have more stringent requirements.
Exactly. Yeah. So to comply with GDPR or the EU AI Act, it still might be necessary to do some form of red teaming. Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you. Yeah. So let's watch this space. But in the meantime, again, we have this described lack of clarity. So our contributions for our work were as follows, and our approach is as follows. So first, we analyze recent high-profile instances of red teaming as case studies, and know that these are based on publicly available materials. Obviously, OpenAI and similar companies do a lot of things behind closed doors, but they still publish white papers and archive posts about what they've been able to do. So we analyzed what we could access via public repositories of information, and we also surveyed research literature related to AI red teaming and jailbreaking. And then NIST issued a request for information from pretty much anyone that had access to the internet. So we actually analyzed all responses to this request for information, as there was a deadline cutoff at which you could submit. And we found that there were responses from big tech and startup companies alike, civil society organizations like Data and Society, and then also just random individuals, anonymous and not de-anonymized as well. And so we analyzed all these responses and detailed their benefits and drawbacks with regard to like what they're commenting on red teaming. Then again, we compile all these things together, and then given these findings and critiques, we provide criteria and questions for evaluators for future red teaming exercises. Any questions on this so far? I know I still spoke a little fast, so. Okay. So yeah, this brings us to the methods part of the talk. So first is our case study analysis, in which we scrutinized 6 high-profile instances of red teaming. Again, you can find links to these in our paper, as well as references and blog posts and things. But yeah, at a high level, these include the usual suspects like Anthropic, OpenAI, DeepMind, Microsoft. But they also include the DEF CON conference, in which attendees were invited to jailbreak these models over the course of a couple of hours. I think they ran this again more recently. So this might be a yearly thing that actually happens at that conference. But we analyze blog posts kind of summarizing their findings and stuff. So basically, in performing this analysis, we wanted to understand common red teaming practices, the typical resources required for doing red teaming successfully, how red teaming shapes these deployed models, various common pitfalls associated with this, and then result disclosure processes. And then our research survey had similar goals in mind, but we studied different types of. Oh, sorry, was that a question or no? Okay, just making sure. So for our research survey, we had similar goals in mind, and we wanted to get similar findings, but we just were sourcing from different domains, right? So these are also kind of the usual suspects when doing literature review. So these include Open Review, Archive, Google Scholar, ACL Anthology, and the ACM Digital Library. And we use terms like AI red teaming, jailbreak, and LLM jailbreak. And so we add this jailbreak term because we consider it pretty similar in spirit to these red teaming papers. And so we opted to include them as part of our review to expand the sample of papers that we retrieved. And then we also use snowball sampling where appropriate. So, using citation trails to add to the papers that we got in our initial set, and then also just from the top of our head, added some works encountered elsewhere. And so with this research survey, here are some overall summary statistics of how many papers we found and how we kind of categorize them and scrutinize them into a couple of different dimensions. So the first dimension that we scrutinize along is the type of risk investigated. And then the second is the type of approach used for investigation. So, and you can also find this table in our paper as well. We consider these risks dissensive if people may disagree on definitions and severity of the risk, such as hate speech or not safe for work images, because hate speech is obviously very contextual, and then maybe not safe for work images are okay if you're not at work. So basically, people might disagree on how harmful these types of risks are. But we consider risks consentive if there's likely much more agreement on definitions and severity. Like privacy leakage, for instance, is pretty much. I think a lot of people would agree that leaking someone's private information is bad, like their credit card or social security number, or malicious code generation, like buggy code or code that produces malwares, universally for the most part frowned upon. And then in terms of these approaches, we categorize them along brute force first. So this is using AI or without AI, in which someone just throws tons of prompts at a language model or similar to try to induce some sort of behavior. We also consider a algorithmic search approach in which people are randomly perturbing or systematically perturbing prompts in order to induce a failure, or a targeted attack method that is specifically trying to exploit a system component. And by component, we mean something that's pretty general. So in some cases, it could be like a safety filter for a text-to-image model, but it could also be the fact that a language model has not been trained on those resource languages. Yes?
What was the time window of the paper survey? You published the paper, 6 months ago? And so you probably did a survey that was going to, late 23, early 24?
Yeah, just about. Yeah. So we were initially aiming for an early 24 deadline. So pretty much this was towards the end of 23 was roughly when our literature review was cut off. I think there might be 1 or 2 papers from early 24 that are also included in that. Just given how we were revising and stuff.
Maybe it's not fair. Maybe I should keep this question for later.
No, it's fine.
There's
Yeah.
been a lot of work since then that could potentially lead to a slightly different taxonomy, or are you seeing new things?
That's a good question. So I haven't checked the space too closely since writing this paper. My hunch is that it won't be too different. I'm actually in the process of working with Anusha again on some literature review stuff of mainly comparing AI red teaming to cybersecurity red teaming. So in that review, there might be some more recent papers surface that could diverge from this taxonomy, but I'm not sure yet. Basically, yeah. Yes.
Could you expand a bit more on when about the 2 cases where the risk is neither dissentive nor consentive?
Right. Yeah. It's a good question. And so there are specific examples of this in the paper, but basically, we found a few papers that were considering both types of risks, like maybe hate speech in addition to privacy leakage, for instance, right? And then the neither case is probably the more confusing one in that there were a couple of papers that were basically introducing the idea of risks should be defined before before actually performing red teaming, in which case they were saying, we start with defining the risk first and specifically what counts as good versus bad, and then building a data set and then doing red teaming based off of that. So that's a good point though. Other questions? Okay. And so also, while we're not going to posit that one type of red teaming is better than another, and these risks and methods may be more nuanced in practice than as we present them here. Especially like sometimes it might be a little bit unclear whether something counts as an algorithmic search versus a targeted attack, for instance. So just keep in mind that things may be more nuanced in real life, in reality, than here. But this is how we've tried to categorize papers, and you can find these again classification counts here as well as in our research paper. And then so regarding these, the request for information, NIST again put out this RFI based on the 2023 executive order. I think in a couple months after. A couple months after this executive order was published and people got a chance to read it, they recruited responses from the general public. And again, like tech companies put together very detailed responses like Google in this document, various civil society organizations like Data and Society. I think Mozilla also had a response. And so they also wrote responses representing the organization. And again, there are also just individual responses, which we can actually see there were quite a many of just individuals writing their own thoughts about, GenAI and red teaming and so on. And so we use this to also support and see where our findings and takeaways were diverging from what other people were thinking in groups. So, questions? No? So yeah, I'll describe the overall takeaways. Again, some of these comments a little bit more on current events, but I think I hope it'll be still impactful and still very much relevant to what's in our paper. So overall takeaways and recommendations. First, we find that as maybe alluded to by the title, red teaming is not a silver bullet or panacea because each red teaming exercise that we encountered only covered a limited set of issues. And because these generative AI tools are marketed as these general purpose tools, only covering a limited set of issues is not going to be sufficient to cover issues and guarantee safety from all angles. So we in turn stress that it may be helpful for some problems, like obviously better to make sure that your models don't descend into hate speech randomly if you ask what's the weather. Like doing red teaming for that purpose is arguably still useful, but asserting it's the solution to everything versus on security theater. And there are also many problems that no amount of red teaming can address. So for instance, there were recent fires in California and extreme hurricanes in Florida. So I think people are thinking a little bit more about climate change and specifically GenAI's impacts on water, energy, and similar resource consumption issues. And so this is just like a subset of various news headlines that you can find about how this is driving a resurgence in gas-fired power. I think there's also another news story about how Memphis's air quality has gotten worse because of XAI supercomputer center there. Again, people are thinking more about how much water is used in ChatGPT queries. So these are just one class of problems that red teaming is not going to address. You can do adversarial testing to again make sure that your model is not generating hate speech randomly, but that's not going to save you when you think about how much water ChatGPT uses in a given query. Additionally, there are ethical quandaries and contradictions of using GenAI for warfare, surveillance, and predictive policing, especially by these various companies purporting to build tools for the benefit of humanity. So you can find these mission statements and about statements from OpenAI and Anthropic about how, hey, our goal is to build safe AI for the benefit of all humanity and so on. And then more recently, these companies have also partnered with Palantir and Anduril, which you can also find similar news stories about how these other companies are doing predictive policing and so on. So so just also keeping in mind that red teaming is not really going to help people think about these ethical quandaries. And it's not going to address these moral and normative issues regarding how these different models are deployed. And then lastly, regarding this, not a panacea idea, There are other problems pertaining to security, privacy, and ownership. So these include things like algorithmic monoculture, where basically a lack of diversity in training data and modeling approaches might lead to brittle models and things that and models that share the same issues, similar to like a crop monoculture, where you grow one type of banana and then there's a fungus that like kills basically all the bananas in the world, right? So this is a paper from a couple of years ago by some really cool researchers like John Kleinberg, who've written about this, and I think this idea has gained more traction in recent years with regards to how there are only a few different foundation models that actually exist. In addition, even if your model is really safe, like all that OpenAI does to safeguard their GPT models, if you deepfake Scarlett Johansson's voice, that's still a problem, right? Especially without her consent. There's also all these various copyright issues and lawsuits that are also that are still current and still underway, in which these models, even if you do make sure that they're not producing any problematic output, the inputs that have been used to train them might also still be problematic if you're not properly compensating the individuals that were providing this data for you. And then again, there are like other deployment and usage issues. There's another recent story about someone committing suicide, this time a teenager, I believe, from using character AI. And someone is allegedly in love with ChatGPT, according to the New York Times. And then there's this recent AI character profile launch that Meta tried to do, but many people considered it a form of digital blackface and similar. And so they shut it down within a couple of hours, but it was, again, just a very similar type of problem in which maybe there is safeguarding and via red teaming and making sure these models aren't producing explicit content, but the ways in which these models are deployed and used can still be problematic. Any questions on these so far? Okay. So now with regard to red teaming more specifically, because the first part was about all the things that red teaming can't really address. So we still find that red teaming, as it's currently conducted, is not very well scoped or structured. So to bring up this table that I introduced earlier, you can see that a lot of the papers we've categorized as dissentive. So the risks that might be okay, or people might actually disagree on whether they count as harmful in certain contexts. So a lot of papers are concerned with things like dissentive risks instead of consentive ones, right? And again, we're not trying to make the case that the 69 papers that decided to do this are bad. We're just trying to say that a lot of effort might have been undertaken to analyze risks that might be actually okay in a certain context. Like, if there's a lot of red teaming work to make sure that ChatGPT or Llama didn't produce any expletives, well, maybe if it's not like a child reading these outputs and is someone reasonably familiar with the real world in which people swear occasionally, that might be okay. In which case, they didn't actually have to undertake red teaming for hundreds of hours, right? Yeah.
So could you give us an example of how people are dissentive? Like, for example, for the brute force, what kind of aspects are people dissentive about this?
Yeah. So basically, so for brute force, for instance, that might involve an example of hiring a lot of crowd workers from Mechanical Turk and saying, okay, generate harmful content and expletives from Claude. Right. I think there's an exact paper that actually does this from Anthropic a couple years ago. In which case, yeah, they hired a bunch of crowd workers to, have them enter tons of prompts against a not safety tuned version of Claude to try to see if it produced harmful output. And so maybe one of these outputs could be instructions on how to rob a store, or build a bomb is another one of these canonical examples of, this is harmful behavior produced by the GenAI. But in a lot of cases, you can also find, instructions on how to build a bomb, or even just reason by yourself how to rob a bank if you really wanted to, right? So there's this question of, even if this is, not great output, is it as harmful as, say, malicious code that you can use to make a phishing attack, right? So this is kind of what I'm getting at with regards to, this dissentive risk idea. In that, again, you could, there's room for debate here. Obviously, you don't want Claude giving people bomb instructions, right? But at the same time, just because someone receives a bomb instruction doesn't mean that they would actually go forth and do the thing. Or, Yeah, and similar with regard to like if there's like hate speech or swears or something like that, depending on the context, might be okay. So that's what I'm trying to get at here. And obviously, room for debate. I'm also not condoning that it's fine for Claude to descend into profanity or give people explosive instructions. But I'm just trying to point out that there's more room for disagreement on these risks as opposed to producing buggy or malicious code. Did that answer your question? Okay. That's a good one. Any others? Okay. So building off of that idea that these risks are very dissentive and there's room for disagreement and debate. A lot of these risks actually grapple with these normative risks. So like what counts as good speech or good text, or what human values should this be aligned with? A very common type of socio-technical GenAI problem. But digging deeper on this idea of these things are normative might lead one to the conclusion that the research that actually is undertaking a lot of this work and risks that's debatable might only reflect viewpoints of the global north, right? And pertaining to Western civilizations. Yeah.
So is there an argument potentially to be made that red teaming, is an attempt at deflecting responsibility that ultimately people should make, right? Yeah, maybe you can get advice to build a bomb, right? And if somehow you get an advice, does it mean that it's okay to build a bomb? Or, we as, human beings should still have the ability to say, maybe I know how to do it, but that's still not such a great idea.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
So, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, and one of my advisors, Zach Lipton, is also kind of in the, so one of my advisors, I think, is maybe taking a point that you're trying to motivate in that, like, some of this red teaming effort and overall goals of some of these companies, like, yes, again, it's like arguably a good thing that, these models aren't necessarily giving, bomb making information off the top, just off the cuff, but also there's arguably this like coddling effect that some of these coddling paternalistic attitude maybe some of these companies have towards the individuals using these things. Ideally, just because a model, like if a model accidentally tells someone to drink bleach because it's a great idea, like someone shouldn't do that, and maybe OpenAI shouldn't be responsible for someone doing that just because ChatGPT said so, because like that should be hopefully a straightforward thing that someone wouldn't want to do. But at the same time, like there are again instances of people really befriending these models, having romantic relationships with them in some sense. So it's kind of unclear.
We are the country, right, where there are the most lawyers,
yes,
as a percentage of population.
Mm-hmm.
We're a country where liability is a very, very big thing. So this is why they will tell you to not open bottles of champagne with your eye right on top,
mm-hmm.
because you could get injured. You go to other places and they assume they don't have rails, literally not guardrails for AI systems, but it's like understood that you're not going to jump over the cliff, even if
Right.
there's not a rail and those kinds of things. So there are different perspectives. Right?
Yes. Yeah.
I'm not saying I'm not arguing one way or the other, but it's
Right.
something to think about.
Yeah. I personally also go back and forth between like trying to do a good thing versus like would people actually do this? Like some of this seems overblown. So yeah, this is great. That's a great point you raise. Another question?
Yeah, I think it's nuanced. I mean, it's like misinformation where the user isn't able to verify information necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
In breach example, if you put breach with some obscure chemical that you have no idea of verifying what they're telling you.
Yeah.
Then the responsibility, I think, should lie with providing this information. But I guess in other circumstances, like them providing this information is not condoning the act necessarily.
Yeah.
So it's like Wikipedia, for instance, will show you methods, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like a balance of like, do I want to be transparent versus how much do I get in your way?
Yeah. On that note, there's actually a couple recent news stories about I forget. I think it's like people trying to use GenAI models to write books on which mushrooms are safe to eat. And I don't know too much about mushrooms, but from what I've gathered about these stories is that a safe to eat mushroom can look very, very similar to one that is incredibly deadly. And so if these models are hallucinating, at least in a couple of instances, they've said that like these very dangerous mushrooms are safe to eat. Like that's to your point, like something where I would agree that someone using these models or maybe even like, Google or whoever themselves like should be maybe a little bit more responsible than saying like it's fine to eat glue on pizza or like drinking bleach is a recommended thing to do. But yeah, it's like, I guess, how much is it common knowledge to know like why mushrooms are safe to eat versus knowing that bleach is dangerous? Yeah.
Another like subpoint, let me know if you need to move
Yeah,
on.
go for it.
For instance, for like some kinds of queries which are like regulated, so medical advice, financial advice, legal advice, like, do you think these should be in some sense like more vetted than like any other advice? Like, should it try to detect that this is like a medical advice query? Like, I should try to not answer it, for instance. Do you feel like red teaming is important there, or do you think it should be left to the discretion of the user?
That's a good question. I don't exactly know if there's a correct answer there. I agree that it would be maybe in an ideal world, like I think there's some other news story or like social media thing about someone uploading their like medical charts or like x-rays to Claude and saying like, yeah, give me this diagnosis. And people are like, it's not a doctor. Why did you do that? So yeah, I think it would be in an ideal world, like maybe unless it's like specifically trained to answer medical questions, like don't do that. And also like, there's all sorts of like privacy concerns and things like that with HIPAA in the United States. At the same time, let's see. Yeah, I think it becomes a little bit more difficult with regards to like where to draw different lines, and also given that these companies are operating globally, as was alluded to earlier, like red teaming still might have to be a thing for the EU because of their data protection and like AI regulations. So I think it might be also a little bit more difficult to say like, oh, well, you're in the US and you're asking a question about medicine, which isn't allowed, but because we have these specific safeguards for the type of model we deploy in the EU, like maybe it's fine. Like I feel like that would be also kind of difficult to implement. But yeah, other questions? Yeah, I'm also happy to go back to some of these points, later on if people like. Okay, thanks. So then there are also, different variations of red teaming across other aspects like team composition and thinking about adversary resources. I think there's a question in the chat. I don't know.
I don't see one.
Yeah, I can read it out.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I can answer it now.
I know you mentioned that some companies do things behind closed doors. Are there not laws in place to make sure that this doesn't happen? So I guess transparency in relation to things going on behind closed doors.
So that's a great question. To my knowledge, I don't believe there are any regulations. In fact, one of our other takeaways is that while red teaming can address everything, and there's also a lot of variation, we also find that actually it's like a couple slides from now. Basically, there's not really a lot of standards for reporting things, and that Anthropic Anthropic's approaches have ranged from like, let's release the entire data set of attacks that we used. When we hired a bunch of crowd workers, let's just release everything that they generated. So here's a data set of red teaming attacks that other people can use. But they've also said like, in a different type of exercise, we'll just use based on a need to know basis, we'll like release our results. So if you're from a relevant field or are a trusted individual, we can actually like give you the results of this red teaming stuff. Yep.
So adding to that Zoom question, so let's say if Anthropic or GP, OpenAI, someone discover a new way of attacking models. So would it be wise for them to release out the method like, hey, we followed this? This is a new attack which we've launched, something like an advanced version of the membership influence attack or something? Or is it best for them to keep it inside and so that people don't figure out like there's a new attack vector and this can be exploited in different ways to attack other models too?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. I don't exactly. So I'll kind of answer this by an allusion to what happens in other fields, especially. So in the paper, we also draw a distinction between red teaming for AI and red teaming for cybersecurity. And so how a cybersecurity, analyst or researcher might answer that question is they're actually given protocols for finding vulnerabilities and then notifying the party, or if it's internally, then fixing the issue first and then tell everyone about like this issue that we found, right? So I think to that answer, to your question, if OpenAI found something internally, ideally they would fix it deploy a new version of ChatGPT or whatever, and then say, oh yeah, by the way, any competitors in this space, like we found this issue with a ChatGPT in which there was like a membership inference attack that was possible, but we fixed it by doing these things, and now it's fixed. Like, don't worry, like we're all good now. Like, update, if you need to update anything locally, like definitely do that, clear the cache, whatever. So like this is actually again something that happened in cybersecurity whenever there are issues found within like given systems. So ideally, OpenAI would do something like that, but because a lot of these companies are not really saying what's in these models, like even the openly released models are not really talking about the data that they use. I think it might be a little bit difficult for something like that to be implemented without more transparency around what their actual training processes and things are. Yeah.
I have 2 points. One is, I think you find this paper called Security Trolley Problems very interesting. It talks about like if you have healthcare devices and suppose someone finds an unfixable problem in a pacemaker, whether you should disclose or not, because a live vulnerability could, for instance, be used like a turn off someone's pacemaker. So it's still unclear in this open problem. Second question is, in your study, did you find any kind of like measurement or some kind of metric for like the success of a red team operation? Is it just like best effort, or is there like some denotation of like this is a successful red teaming campaign?
Yeah, I believe a few papers were listing, of all the red teaming prompts that they tried, and how many of them produced, harmful answers according to some criterion. I think similar to, like how many models that they were able to jailbreak or how many queries, or like what percentage of the time were they able to induce some sort of harm. So yeah, usually some sort of attack success rate type metric.
It's not the complete necessarily. There could always be some indefinite number of.
Right. Yeah, or some other like risk area that they didn't consider, right?
Yeah, so even adding to that question, like I think that you cannot define a specific metric for assessing a red teaming success because recently in the DeepSeek's guardrails report by Cisco, they mentioned that it gave out information for making LSD 25, but when I asked about making crystal meth, then it told that it can't give information.
Right.
So both are drugs, and it gave one and it didn't give one. So we just can't conclude that something's like obviously it's bad, but a definite metric cannot be derived as what my thought is.
Yeah, and that's definitely fair. And again, like these risk surfaces are impossibly broad, and that human language is like very unstructured compared to other types of like at least compared to computer languages, for instance, right? So that's one way I kind of think about how one might try to gauge language model resilience versus like software resilience. But yeah, I agree.
You need space.
Right.
How can you do it?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Which again, like better than nothing, but it's not going to cover everything. I agree. Other questions? Yeah, I can try to quickly go back to this point, just about how red teaming there's a lot of variation involved, and that even if you do try to call for more diversity, even diversity can be defined in different ways. So there's been prior work on how things like GPT-4 can be jailbroken because they're not really adapted to low resource languages. So then the obvious response to that is we need more multilingual red teaming and like more multilingual data sets. Then thinking more about red teaming from an AI for science perspective, then the obvious call is for the AI for science community to be more involved. Which I'm not saying there's a right answer here, but depending on what exactly you're interested in, so you were talking about like the drugs thing earlier, like maybe a drug chemist would be really useful, but then that's not going to cover things related to like cybersecurity, right? Like or like being able to generate phishing attacks or malicious code from Code Llama. So just saying like we need more diversity is also not enough to fix this, unfortunately. And so with all these things in mind, there is this relatively recent sort of, it's like basically, so first, this executive order that was, well, I guess now it's been retracted, but this was kind of alluding to the fact that red teaming is this more established practice than what these papers and case studies were actually suggesting. And then there's also this more recent like relatively recent survey from members of these AGI labs that have said that yes, we should be doing external red teaming for the most part. But again, we don't really know what red teaming itself is, right? Because there are all these different definitions that can involve different definitions of risk and members involved and so on. And so even some of the requests for information from like big tech companies and startups have also been saying that it would be great if NIST could provide more guidance on what counts as good red teaming. Again, still interesting to see what will happen given recent administration changes. But this is, something that many have commented on. And then, back quickly to this other point about there's really no standards for reporting or mitigation. Again, Anthropic's different approaches ranging from release all the red teaming attacks, which could be overwhelming for any given person, to releasing things on a need-to-know basis, which could also really hamper people's ability to see not only what has been done to safeguard Claude, but also if what has been done to safeguard Claude is actually useful to their use cases, right? Because again, someone might want to use it for medical things versus just helping write an essay. And then, so for on the point of someone externally doing red teaming or finding issues like bug bounty, similar adjacent things, they can still do that. They can still do this red teaming and reach out to these GenAI model developers, but it's kind of unclear what the responses might be. So maybe they'll respond, and maybe OpenAI or similar could say like, yeah, we've addressed it, but you don't really know again what's been done to address it. Or they might say, okay, like we've noticed, but we've already released Llama, for instance. So these are just excerpts or examples from 2 papers that followed responsible disclosure norms from, again, cybersecurity or similar fields to say, we reached out to them, we let them know about this for 90 days, and, they know about this, but we're going to, now publish this paper because the XYZ happened or we didn't hear back from them or whatever. One call out here is that one of these papers, this went semi-viral on social media about telling like ChatGPT to repeat poem, like the word poem indefinitely, caused it to leak training data. And so OpenAI did respond to this. But if you note the dates between when they first notified OpenAI about the flaw and how the flaw was actually still produced, it was actually this 90 days. So like OpenAI only fixed it once it became a problem because everyone was doing it on social media. So just again to call out that, like, yes, you could do red teaming, yes, you could find issues, but it's not exactly clear what results are going to be disclosed here, or even how these issues found are going to be mitigated. Questions on that? That's the last takeaway. We can go to further questions and then kind of what this means for red teaming going forward. Yeah.
So on the topic of responsible disclosure, I was thinking that if say some of the more dominant players in the market, if they start releasing some of the problems that they've found and fixed, create this kind of like race where perhaps like companies that aren't able to invest as much resources in red teaming will have models that fall far behind. Do you think that would how do you think that kind of affect usage of these models?
Yeah. So corporate capture might be what you're alluding to or recent, but that's also been something. I don't know if it's addressed in our paper, but that's something that we've at least been mulling over and thinking about. And that, if red teaming were to be something that federally mandated that these various AI companies could do, OpenAI, Microsoft, and Google obviously have more more capacity to do that than a startup of 2 guys that are trying to fine-tune Llama for something, right? So they wouldn't be able to run red teaming as effectively as people in these bigger companies or very well-funded startups. So that's one consideration that you might have in mind. And I think with regard to usage, that might also be something else, because if people let's say some amount of red teaming is done by these bigger companies relative to the smaller ones, and they're able to find more issues, that might also affect downstream usage. I agree with you that again, depending on how this is mandated, could also affect which models become more successful.
And concentrate power in a few.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Did you have a question?
Yeah, my question was similar, just whether public pressure would be a better, or it has been a better way to keep the companies accountable, or if it's company to company pressure to keep each other accountable, and what your opinion on that would be.
Yeah, right now it seems more maybe it's a bit of both. I was going to say it's more company to company, but I think there is some amount of pressure from the public if they find something really problematic with ChatGPT, again, like this poem thing, then like OpenAI will fix it. So yeah, I think ideally there's just generally more public pressures. Again, not just regarding like this red teaming stuff, but also like these training data sources, copyrighted info and content and stuff. Yeah. So I think ideally there would be a little bit more public pressure, but I think given how things are operating now, there's not really that much. Other points? Yeah.
In situations where models are trained on companies' data, some confidential data, and it's possible that that data is being leaked by that model to some person in public, or it might be leaked to some other employees which are not supposed to look at that data. So for example, like Windows activation score or something like that.
Yeah.
So who would be liable in that scenario? Will it be the company who has trained the data, who is given the permission to train the model on the confidential data, or will it be the company who's built the foundation models? Are there any regulations in this space?
That's a great question. I'm unfortunately not a tech lawyer, but I think liability is something that people are really starting to grapple with these days in terms of like tech policy and who's liable, especially with regard to what you brought up about private information, about copyright, like if Stable Diffusion trains on someone's art, who's like obviously since Stable Diffusion shouldn't have done that, but then if someone takes what Stable Diffusion generated and sells it as their own, like who's ultimately responsible? Like Stable Diffusion wants to say the person who actually used Stable Diffusion to like produce the art that was basically plagiarism of the first artist, right? But the original artist wants to say Stable Diffusion probably, because without Stable Diffusion existing, that second person wouldn't have done it in the first place. That's what I'd imagine is likely kind of the finger pointing going on with all these copyright debates. But again, I'm not a lawyer or a tech lawyer, so you should not trust my word for it. But you raise an interesting point. I think there were a couple other questions on this. I don't know which hand was first. I saw this one and that one. Sorry. I guess I could answer. Yeah.
So I had a question around what you mentioned, that there is no federal pressure around red teaming. So, like for example, these SOC 2 and other audits, they mandate a third-party vendor audit, like a VAPT for companies.
Mm-hmm.
Are there no standards for AI red teaming, or are there some things that are still being made? Is it in process, or what is it around that? Are there no audits around it, or nothing mandated around it?
So there are at least like various frameworks, taxonomy similar to ours. I think even a couple of open source packages released by, I think Microsoft has one called Pirate, like PYRIT. And so yeah, there is some amount of emerging tooling and frameworks around red teaming. It's not really, at least was maybe at some point like in the past couple of years from the federal level, but I think going forward, I don't know how strongly that's going to be enforced. Yeah.
So there's nothing around the legal and audit perspective that they have to do this every year. There's no such thing.
To my knowledge, not currently. I think NIST was trying to get something like that underway, but I'm not sure if that happened before the executive order was rescinded. Yeah. Tim and then you. Yeah.
Another question.
Oh, there's another question over here too. Sorry. Okay.
Thinking about it, like, I don't know if this is like a scope of red teaming, but I was just like wondering if like the addresses like growing public skepticism towards like original work. Because like for example, like recently I've seen back home like a lot of photographers like they started like getting a lot of comments about like that their work is not original anymore. Like the public kind of like drawing the line between AI, GenAI, and like the original work is growing. Therefore, like they are starting to think like the original work is kind of like generated AI. So I was just wondering like the red teaming kind of addresses that side of the problem as well.
I think that's another problem in the like things red teaming can address bucket. And so I've also kind of been mulling over like I feel like the average Silicon Valley like VC versus your like relatively small or medium town like school teacher have probably very different views on ChatGPT, because one of them it's like this huge source of money and funding, and they just throw money at it and they keep getting money back because a lot of people still use ChatGPT. but then the school teacher is like seeing all this like as a language model, like generated responses to essays and stuff, and they're like, okay, well now I'm just basically a ChatGPT like detector instead of actually trying to teach these students. So yeah, I think that's something else that red teaming can address, and I think is a really good point that there is kind of this divergence between like maybe what a lot of the general public thinks versus a lot of people in like tech in Silicon Valley think. Yeah. I think it was you and then you, right? Okay.
Yeah. So I had, you were talking about the limitations of red teaming. So if I have redeemed a model and I found out that it's leaking something, one of the other things,
Yeah.
can we conclude that the way in which the model was trained, or let's say they've used a specific architecture, or that architecture is responsible for this leakage, or is it just related to that specific model, or can we directly criticize the methods they've employed
I think
based on the red teaming result?
Yeah, I think you need to do something a little bit more systematic to try to do cause pinpointing. So red teaming at least has mostly explored, by work to be found, and mostly by work to be found. We're just looking at this language model. In most cases, as a black box. Sometimes there were a couple of cases in which they were playing with model weights and stuff. But in a decent number of cases, especially again these brute force cases, they were just throwing prompts at it and seeing what happened, or still treating the model as a black box, but then iterating on prompts until some more harmful response was generated. So I think in that sense, it would be hard to say if it's like a cause of the data, if it's a cause of the model architecture, or like even the type of fine tuning framework they use, like PPO versus DPO. Or like even what types of evaluators they're using to say like whether one response is good or bad. I think that's a little bit harder, and you could imagine like doing multiple stages of red teaming, like one of them being with just the model, base trained versus another model where it's fine tuned versus another model where it's got additional fine tuning. In that case, you could maybe do some pinpointing, but again, it would be a little bit more difficult. Just at least with the methods we have now and with the types of red teaming that was explored here. Yes, your question.
Yeah, two questions. So the first one is, as part of your literature review, I think some of the papers you examine include surveys on experts on like their insights into AI red teaming. So like for some of the risks and challenges you mentioned, have those expert surveys offered any insights into potential solutions?
I think a couple. So. At least one of them, which I think I commented on, it's a work by Sorel Friedler and a couple other people. I think it was at Data and Society, I forget. But yeah, so they had some policy brief kind of similar, with takeaways similar to what we were writing, in that like red teaming can't only be one type of tool used to safeguard risks, and it should be part of a broader suite of tools and things deployed and reasoned about. So that's like one answer, I guess, in terms of people, like other experts and people trying to address these things. But then, yes, we've also been thinking a lot ourselves about the types of, types of risks and harms. I think there was another paper that we cited based on like hate speech, in which they also kind of were interviewing maybe content moderators on what counts as hate speech. And so we also kind of use their insights to say like even hate speech, which is again one of the canonical examples of red teaming, can be very nuanced if you think about like slurs that are reclaimed, or even trying to like even mentioning quoted hate speech as like, hey, this is a thing that's bad. Someone I know has said this thing. Like we don't want that. Like a hate speech detector or language model employed as one might just encounter that without the context of like we're saying this is bad, and might say that that's still bad, even if you're trying to say like that's still the bad thing. So I think if that answers your question, like we have looked at other sources and like takeaways from other experts regarding what might be better policies going forward. But yeah, we still encourage like other feedback with regards to like our takeaways and stuff.
Yeah, thank you for your response. My second question is that AI red teaming is it's a hugely interdisciplinary field. Right, and then I think, like some people mentioned, I think lending the practice of the principle of responsible disclosure into the AI red teaming space.
Yeah.
But it's possible that the AI community is not widely aware of this practice and might not take actions appropriately. So, and I think it's
it's difficult to like bring talent from across the two fields, specifically into this space. So like, what's your view on like how we can better promote the AI red teaming space by like essentially exchanging the best like practices from both fields and developing skills specifically catered to AI red teaming?
Yeah, good question. I think there needs to be some amount of recognition from at least people in these like AI spaces that they might not know everything, which I know sounds like very, very simplistic and stuff, but I feel like I've seen so many instances of, people trying to do AI like mitigation, trying to do the right thing, and then a lot of people from other fields being like, yeah, this is a thing in psychology from like years ago. Like similar to how, people have anthropomorphized ChatGPT, and it's like Eliza, like that chatbot experiment is decades old, right? Or Anthropic saying, hey, we're putting error bars on our charts now, and everyone being like, were you not doing that before? That was like an established practice. So I feel like, yeah, part of like making red teaming a little bit more established will be to, similar to, I guess, like this slide, I forget, like reason a little bit more about who should be, reasoning a little bit more about including, domain experts and subject matter experts, which I will say that some of Anthropic's recent work, the work that they were saying that, feel free to reach out to us, like if you want to know the results of this, like they were using subject matter experts, and I think maybe a couple of other big companies are. But like, I think especially as, trying to red team these systems or, evaluate these systems requires a lot of domain expertise. Like getting people with that right expertise is going to be really important.
Great insight.
Thanks. Other questions? Oh, yes, sorry.
I'm just still a little bit, I know there's a lot of things that are not yet decided, what should be counted as like right or wrong, but like, because the definition of AI red teaming, right,
yep.
Is to find flaws. And so does flaws mean like if a thing is just plainly wrong, like for example, like math problems, like if you did math wrong, then that's definitely wrong. But like, how do you argue about like there are so many fields that you can ask questions to, like AI, for example, like geology and like cultural problems. Like, how do you define flaws in that case? And like, if it's so hard to define flaws, then like, how do we actually deal with it? Like, how do we actually tell or like define an AI that is actually safe or like that it actually does not have any flaws or vulnerabilities?
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. So this is what we were trying to get at with regards to this risk categorization of dissentive versus consentive. And to your point about, like math, if you get addition wrong, that's pretty clear wrong answer, right? But whether something is offensive to someone or whether something's culturally inappropriate, those require a little bit more nuance and context. And so one answer is to bring in more subject matter experts or domain experts to kind of talk about what what might be considered a risk or a flaw. But even that is not going to necessarily be the fix, because various researchers even disagree with each other on especially in the social sciences about like what causes, effects, and harms and things are, right. So yeah, I think the short answer to your question is like in some cases it might be difficult or impossible to define what a harm or flaw is, in which case maybe just using an established definition when you come up with yourself or one from existing research literature might be an approach. But yeah, I think the longer answer is it depends, and I think just trying your best is still like worthy and valuable. Yeah.
So just another thought here. I was thinking about, so I used to have, this company that had, among other things, an anti-phishing email filter, and we're competing in this space where there are all sorts of different email filters out
Yep.
there, and you've got to evaluate against that. And if you take old phishing emails and you evaluate, all the different products out there, they all do perfectly because they've had enough time incorporate that into the various signatures and other techniques that they've got. So the real way to evaluate this is to really do it in real time, right, and see what's coming in and see how well these things are doing. And I think, red teaming has its place, the way it's done. I mean, it's not like it's a complete waste of time, but it clearly has very significant limits. Seems to me that there's a need for other complementary approaches, and obviously there are lots of other things that can be done in this space, but there may be a need to also somehow, capture real-time data somehow from all the different queries that are being submitted by people.
Yeah.
Or maybe, create some kind of a pipeline, obviously with all the right privacy guarantees and so on, and then evaluate how these different tools do so that you can effectively rank them. I mean, part of this ideally would be to say, okay, we're going to block all these things, but that's an illusion.
Yeah.
Right. And so at the end of the day, you'd like to have some kind of a score that says, by and large, this thing, seems to be doing pretty well. On, 1 million queries submitted yesterday, randomly sampled according to good criteria, and automated evaluation also, because you cannot do this at scale with people looking at this. This one got this score, this one got that score, this one got this score.
Yeah.
Seems like there might be value in doing something like that on top of the red teaming, sort of being done ahead of time, right?
Yeah.
Not necessarily being, aligned with the actual queries that are going to be submitted by people.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I think there are a couple things that are maybe incremental towards doing something like on-the-fly red teaming, or red teaming daily. But yeah, I agree that we don't exactly have the tooling or framework or infrastructure there. One of them being that actually a lot of these prompts and red teaming communities come from Reddit. Like there are various communities where you can search for this is a new jailbreaking, prompt, or do anything now prompt I came up with. And so that's not going to be captured by the research literature or even archive papers as quickly as just going to Reddit or Discord and seeing what people are trying. And I think maybe if there were some way to scrape Reddit or something in a way that's responsible and ethical to then get all of these jailbreak prompts, that could be something moving towards what you're talking about.
Right.
And then also, we don't cover it here, but there's been a lot of both emphasis and hype, I think, in good ways and bad, around the all these leaderboards and benchmarks. So the LMSys, LLM Arena has gotten a lot of attention recently. Again, I think it's deserved. It's a pretty cool idea of trying to test these models against different benchmarks, and maybe if that's run daily with some number of red teaming prompts, that might also be a way to try to get some sort of real time estimate of security. Yeah. Other questions? I think am I doing final time?
You're doing great. I mean, we could give you another 13 minutes if you wanted to. We could also break now.
Okay.
So whichever way you want to do it. We cannot exceed 13 minutes because people will start streaming in.
Okay.
At 1:50 and they're going to look very angry.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. I don't want that. I have a couple more slides. Just on recommendations for future red teaming, and you can also find these in the paper too. But just first to recap our takeaways is that red teaming is not a panacea. It's not well scoped or structured. It again doesn't really have these standards for reporting or mitigation. So what to recommend in light of these findings? So we came up with these different criteria for future red teaming and for future red teams to consider that involve criteria to think about before the activity or pre-activity, then during or within the activity, and then after or post the activity. And so just to give some examples, these pre-activity criteria are things relevant to determining the exercise parameters before conducting any evaluations. So again, before just throwing a ton of prompts at ChatGPT or Llama, thinking a little bit more about what is, first the target model that we're going to evaluate, obviously, but then thinking about, what are we going to define as a successful exercise, or even determining whether something's harmful. What threat model are we assuming? What adversary resources, what resources does the adversary have? Do they only have black box access to the model, or if it's an open source model, can they download and do additional fine tuning? These are things that we also found were kind of underspecified in a lot of these works. And again, going back to definitions of diversity with regard to the red team, thinking a little bit more about team composition would be really useful. And then so during or within the activity, thinking about what resources are available, can you use AI assistants to try to help automate finding prompts? or are you just like relying on human ingenuity and scale to generate and find like red teaming prompts? What instructions were given to frame and guide the activity? Like there's obviously a trade-off between telling participants to focus only on this specific area on this type of risk, because that might limit what types of prompts and responses you're going to get, but then leaving the activity too broad without any instructions could leave participants confused and not really sure what they're supposed to do. And then, so again, what methods are they going to utilize to test the artifact is also important to think about. And then lastly, this is mostly commenting on evaluating success and thinking about reports and documentation. So what's actually going to be released, what's going to be written up, what were the resources the activity consumed. So even commenting on things like, we paid X many people Y dollars, or X people with this specific expertise were hired as part of this activity. That could also be really useful for future practitioners and also people thinking about the model that's been evaluated and mitigated. And then on the topic of mitigation, like what actually is going to happen in light of these issues that you find. So don't worry about reading this table right now. Again, reproduced in our paper, but we have broken down these questions and criteria into considerations that red teams might want to consider. And so this is by no means final. It's published, but we're actively looking for feedback and comments on these types of criteria and questions. And so we leave further refinement of them as future work. So yeah, that's all I have. Happy to still take questions, but thank you.
Well, thank you so much. So we have time for a couple of questions. Anybody in the room or anybody in the chat?
Oh,
yeah. I guess what you base this on, if there's like other fields that do similarly within post activity.
So undoubtedly, I think there should be other fields that also think about like before, during, and after questions and criteria. We're not aware of them off the top of our heads, but these were just things that we kind of came up with based on what we were seeing in these from the results of our explorations. Oh, link to the paper. Yes, it should be both on archive and as part of the AIES conference of this past iteration. So AIES 2024. So
if you go to Google Scholar, right?
or Scholar, it should be there too. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Oh, yes, thanks.
Other questions? Well, thank you again, Michael.
Thank you for having me.